Hi there, and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now today we actually begin on Project B, so that's raising the goods yard just a little bit so we can gain better clearance for the track that runs underneath. So just a brief outline of what's covered in today's video. We start with the demolition, then we move on to actually working out the new layer that's going to go over the top, and then we also get into some track work and a bit of wiring. I also take a look at the point installation and in particular the point motors themselves, as there is a particular method that I use. Now what I've done is actually broken that video out into a separate video rather than include it in this video. So towards the end of this video there'll be a wee caption that will come up at the bottom just indicating where the separate video is relevant to this particular video. So I think probably without further ado, it's just a case of getting into it. So before we start the demolition process, I thought I'd just sort of run through what kind of tools I'm going to be using. So there's various sort of things here that I think might be handy during the process. So we've got a couple of different sets of pliers. Of course, the pin nose pliers will be lifting the track pins out. Got ourselves a marker pen so we can mark out where we need to cut the baseboard. We've got a selection of craft knives, so the finer one of course we'll probably get into using that when we try to lift the buildings off that section of baseboard. Some screwdrivers, because we do have most of this baseboard screwed in places, and I honestly can't recall whether I also glued it as well, so we'll find that out of course as we go along. And then lastly we've got our Dremel. Now I've got a extension on this Dremel so that I can actually get down a little bit closer. There's still going to be a bit of an angle on the cut, but the cut I'll make sure goes inwards rather than outwards so that the panels can lift out. And then of course we've got a ruler for marking out obviously where there's going to be straight sections of the cut. So we're going to begin the process now of dismantling all of this area, and we'll start with the buildings, then we'll move on to marking out the area that needs to be cut, and then once I've done that then we can start lifting up the track work. So I'll just speed through this process because there's probably really not a lot to see apart from me destroying some of my handiwork from years gone by. So it's pretty much done in terms of demolition on the actual baseboard itself. Of course, there's still the buildings to attend with, but I think I'll just hold off on those in the meantime. And as I discovered, some of it I had glued, so it was a little bit more difficult to get off. And the Dremel sort of worked, and then it kind of didn't really work. I did do some parts with the Dremel, but it sort of took quite a bit of time, so some of this I actually just cut through multiple times with a craft knife. So the theory is, and I might need to cut through that a little bit more here where I was using the Dremel. The Dremel certainly done the hard work on this one. This is 7mm ply, and this is 6mm MDF, and then down there we've got 3mm MDF. So there's a multitude of different layers in here, and as you can see from the framework, I mean, I'm going to say it's a real Franken-style construction. Now, I don't know if that's actually a real word, but that's how I'm describing this. And we've now got a bit of lift here, so this part here, of course, I'm not cutting out completely, so the split will come all the way back to here, and then I'm actually just simply going to bend this piece of panel up to meet with the incline going up. So what I'm actually going to do is build a completely new section that will fit in here. It'll actually have its own framework, which is that 24mm square timber, and just to go over this whole area. So the next step obviously is to actually start to work out the shape that this new baseboard layer is actually going to be in here. And what I'm actually going to use, as I mentioned, is the 24mm square batten, and then there will be a 5 or 6mm MDF layer over the top. But of course I need to work out the shape for this, so what I've actually done is, just using a bit of tracing paper, has worked out the curve that's underneath there, and then I can take that over just some scrap cardboard. So generally what I usually find is the easiest way is just to create the baseboard layer just using cardboard initially and use that as a template, so I can get everything fitting perfectly using this card, and once I'm happy with that, then I can translate that to the actual MDF. So there'll be another piece of card that will slot in here, and I've got to work out the shapes for around there. And of course it's a little bit tricky because the framework is just so bespoke. There is some issues over this end. We've got the curve of the road, and so I've created a cardboard template for that road, because what I'm actually going to do is have a bit more of a retaining wall rather than what it used to be, which was a bit of kind of sloping embankment, and bring that up, and then it will start to graduate into an embankment. So that's now the cardboard template set up, and I'm pretty happy with the shape and how it fits into the existing baseboard. And I've simplified this end so that I can just run battens through this way. So I'm going to transfer this now to some MDF and then work up a frame for underneath that. And there may well be some further modifications required. For example, here, this beam that's in here at the moment, I suspect is too high, so I'll probably need to trim this back a bit, but we'll come back shortly with the MDF. Right, so I've moved ahead a little bit further, and we've now got the MDF layer that has now been cut out from the cardboard template that I'd made up previously. So as you can see, I've just temporarily placed some track roughly how it's actually going to be laid out. And the reason for that really is because I wanted to sort of mark out where I've got to make a cut in this MDF layer here, and also another cut down here, because this part will be at the upper level, and then this section here is the piece that's going to be on the incline. So I've also just wedged a piece of timber under here just to sort of get an idea of the elevation coming up from this piece. Of course, once I cut this section here, this piece here will actually go back down to its level. So there will actually be a step here, and I'll sort of think about what I'm going to do here. So I had a bit of a look at the idea of another siding coming off from here and coming around and into potentially some kind of dockyard. And the more I sort of looked at it and the amount of space that's available, I decided to scrap that idea in the end, because there's just not enough room in here really to work with anything, and I kind of think it will just get too overcrowded. This area here, I'm sort of thinking of going back to what I'd originally planned, and it would actually just be some landscape rolling hills type area through here that undulate and go below the track level. So I've now separated these buildings from the original mini baseboard that they sat on, and I kind of salvaged them the best I can. They are going to need some repair work on them, but it's nothing too major. So we're going to have our siding coming in here, which will be where the rails will be in the cobblestone, and I'm actually pushing this goods shed back sort of about here somewhere, so that means that this head shunt crossing will actually move further down that way. And I'm not too sure about the cattle dock, because as much as it kind of looked interesting, the era of the layout, you know, we're talking late 50s through to even up to the very early 70s, and I think really cattle docks had really disappeared by that point. And so I'm just going to actually just leave that for now. I'd kind of rather have the space for the actual goods yard itself, where lorries can come in and unload their goods. So this set of shops has actually moved further this way. I think originally it was all the way down here somewhere, so that is now going to move further up that way. So that's where we've got to so far, and as I mentioned, I've marked out now where to cut this, and then I also have to sort of work out some kind of supports under here for the incline area, and I can probably start working on the framework for under this layer. So I've now prepared the entry point into the yard, which is this section of baseboard which I've split and raised up, and then of course this baseboard will be elevated up, and then I need to cut through here as I mentioned before, and then that will come down to meet this new level. So I've done a little bit of track reconfiguration actually, because over in this area here on the approach into the yard and one of the main lines, I'd always intended to put in a crossover so that some trains can actually exit onto the third line. So there was a bit of reconfiguring here, and I've now installed point motors and so forth. They're not wired up yet, but I thought I'd get that done while I had the chance. So the next step really is to start working the track up through here, and I did draw a rough sort of radius here of where the track will go, and what I need to do now is really get the frame underneath this baseboard sorted out, get it up to its new level, and of course do this incline. So in terms of point motors and things like that, and I will cover this when I get to this point here and installing this point motor, I will actually go into a little bit of detail about how I install point motors on this layout. But I'm actually using some of the Rails Connect point motors and the CDU devices. So I have used one of these elsewhere on the layout and they work quite well. The great thing about these wee devices is they are kind of future-proofed if I ever end up going for DCC accessories and DCC control points. But the beauty is that you can control these just with simple analog switches as well. And of course I have a little wee template here that sits over the top of the point motor and sandwiched underneath the track itself, and that helps when it comes to ballasting, of ballast not falling down the holes where the pin comes through for the point. So the next step is to get this framework done and make this split here and take it from there. So that is the frame now made up, and it is about as Franken-style actually as the baseboard framework as well. So it seems to be some kind of theme going on here when it comes to my framework, but there were certain things that I really had to consider. For example, there is no framework in this area here because that's where the trackwork runs underneath. So of course if I put framework through here, then that defeats the whole purpose of why I'm raising this level, because we needed this clearance. So because of the peculiar shape, it's kind of all over the place a little bit, but also I had to do the frames in such a way that it would avoid where point motors are going as well. So we've got these holes in here, and of course there was a little bit of a miscalculation on this one here. I did have to cut into a little bit of the framework there, but it's not too bad. So we'll slot this into position. And as you can see, I have given it a base coat of paint, because using MDF it does tend to warp, so it's a very good idea to paint the MDF. That just sort of helps to seal it in. And also, when it comes time to ballasting, you're not going to get the watery glue mix seeping through into the actual MDF, so it does create that protective layer. So we've now got a nice sort of flush transition between these two pieces here, and as part of the secure anchoring of this upper level is there will be some screw fittings that will go in, but I'll make sure I have access to that if I ever need to lift this off. So I'll probably put another anchor screw down that end there somewhere, but it doesn't need a great deal. So really the next step now is to actually start installing some of this track work, and I'd set out some rough track work previously, and I've sort of changed it a little bit. So what I actually found is a 4th radius curve actually worked quite well here, so that is a bit of fixed set track. And then we have our head shunt through here, and it's a short section through there, so this has been extended just a little bit, but it's not a great deal from the original track plan in here. So I've now laid all of the track, and you'll probably notice as I jump through into some close-up views, I just use tiny little wee nails that you get from the local hardware store to temporarily pin the track down. And the reason I use that is because they've got large heads on them, which means you can grip them with the pliers to pull them out. So once the track is all ballasted, then those pins will come out. So where the upper level incline joins the main baseboard, I've overlapped the track a little bit there, and that has been anchored with track screws. So what I did is laid the track, screwed it all down, and then cut through the rails with a Dremel. Now I'm not quite sure how durable that is actually going to be. I may actually, over time, if it becomes an issue, use solder plates to slip in under there and solder the rails down. So I went ahead and also put in all the dropper wires, and because there's quite a lot of different sections of track in here, I thought it might be best to actually put dropper wires on every single piece of track, and that way you're going to get a very good electrical connection and also DCC signal as well. And once I'd done that, then it was a case of wiring up some of the points, wiring in these Rails Connect CDUs slash decoders, and installing them also under the baseboard. So it sort of became quite a jungle of wires under there. It's not one of my fortes doing electrical side of things, and by comparison, for example, Charlie from Chadwick Model Railway, he is meticulous with his wiring. I wish I could do it like that, but it just never seems to end up that way. So I've got a temporary switch attached to one of the CDU units, so I could have just tested the point motors, because obviously the head shunt crossover, one CDU is actually powering both point motors, because obviously both points are going to fire at the same time. So when it came to soldering the dropper wires, I just soldered them to the outside of the rails. I know that some people like to solder them to the underside of the rail, and that way you really basically get an invisible connection on the scenic side. I don't tend to sort of go to those lengths, and by the time you've done some ballasting, it's relatively discreet. So I just tin the end of the wire, bend it over into a sort of an L shape, and then it's just a case of dropping a wee bit of solder on the outside of the rail, and then of course soldering the wire in place, and then it gets slotted through a small hole right in between the sleepers down underneath the baseboard. So I've placed the buildings more or less where they're actually going to be. So as you can see, this set of shops has moved along further. There are some things that I'm going to need to change and alter. For example, these terraced houses or low relief houses here aren't really suitable any longer because they were designed for the sloping road here, and of course now we've really basically up to the same level as where the road is. So what I'm actually going to do here is reform this piece of road in here and actually just line it up so it's level, and that should look quite reasonable there. We've got the goods shed in place, and my thoughts are I'm actually going to extend this platform out and actually turn it into sort of a triangular shaped platform, so it actually lines up with this track as well. So then it would actually become double-sided goods platform, and even actually coming around the corner of the building where lorries can also actually unload goods and materials just straight on to the platform as well. And I'll probably push the platform out a little bit, about to here somewhere. So the next thing really that I need to do, and I will probably do this off camera because there's probably a bit of fiddling around and testing, and then what I'll do is show a wee snippet in the next episode in this series, because what I really need to do now is test this track and run it through its paces with various different locomotives and rolling stock and just make sure that it's all kosher. So I have got a power feed now connected, but that now needs to head to a distribution board for the DCC, and I really actually need to probably hook up the point motors to control panel as well. So the control panel, there is a little bit of surgery needed for that as well, and that means I'm going to have to take all the switches off that control panel to get the panel out and modify that, put the switches all back in again. So there's a little bit of fiddling around that's probably really not worth filming, and once I've done that, then I will test the point motors as well at the same time. So there we have it for the first episode in this series on Project B. So as I mentioned, I'll be doing some testing of the track work, and that will come up in the next episode. There's still some other little bits and bobs to finish off in that area in terms of some more dropper wires added into the main baseboard section as well. So once again, this video has actually become quite lengthy, but it's certainly been packed with a fair amount of information. So I'll sign off for now. Do take care, everyone. Look after yourselves. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.